Greetings. My name is Dr. Alex Loktionov. I'm a fellow in archaeology at the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research at the University of Cambridge, a visiting senior research fellow at King's College London in the Department of Political Economy, and professor of Egyptology at the Institute of Oriental and Classical Studies at HSE University in Moscow. Please bear with me for one moment as I set up my presentation. Let's see if we can get this slideshow to work from the beginning. Now let's move this bar to the top. It doesn't seem to want to go up, but I'm hopefully going to do that now. Good. Okay, and now we can make a start. So first of all, I'd like to thank the ICEIPI organizers for the opportunity to offer a keynote at this important gathering. I'm particularly pleased by its international nature and by the wide range of topics represented. As an ancient historian with a special interest in the way societies are governed and how they construct order, I'd therefore like to contribute to the discussion by giving a paper concerned with the evolution of some institutions, which are nowadays considered fundamental to statehood. Given that the very name of this conference mentions education and also psychology, I believe it's important to highlight the role of the state as an institution that helps to shape both these factors. And if we wish to understand the state as an institution, or rather to understand the institutions that collectively make up the state, it's a good idea to pay some attention to the early history of how these developed. This is exactly what this keynote seeks to achieve. The polity that I've chosen to discuss is ancient Egypt, and that's for two main reasons. The first is simply because that's what I work on. As an Egyptologist with a particular focus on questions of law and governance, I've held research posts in this area in Cambridge, London, Moscow, and Washington, D.C. But the second reason is much more interesting. It's because ancient Egypt provides us with an unparalleled richness of data for a state existing a full millennium before classical Greece, a society which, at least in Europe, is still widely held up as a point of departure for the development of state institutions. The other major literate societies contemporary to ancient Egypt were Mesopotamia, which rarely existed as a stable and unified state, China, which probably did exist as a state but left far fewer written records in this period, and the Indus Valley, whose script remains undeciphered. Thus, if we want to look at records pertaining to the development of state institutions in the earliest phase of written human history, there's simply no better place to look than Egypt. So, in highlighting the place of ancient Egypt in constitutional history, I'm going to follow a four-part structure. First, I'll introduce a methodological paradox applicable not only to Egypt, but to the study of any monarchical system. And that is the challenge of separating evidence for reigning from evidence for ruling. Then I'll briefly set out the conventional interpretations of pharaonic power, and I'll question the existing assumptions by offering examples that show that, instead of simply being arbitrary, pharaonic rule was guided by very specific institutions and principles, which are important to the wider history of statehood. And then I'll put all of that together in a single overarching model. So let's start with the key evidential complexity, which I'd argue often leads to historical evidence about monarchy being fundamentally misinterpreted. In Britain, the society where I'm from, we have a king. Everyone knows that. Everyone also knows that the king isn't really responsible for running the country. He reigns but does not rule. However, if one is tasked with attempting to reconstruct how the UK operates as a country based on textual and material evidence alone, that is, without any intrinsic knowledge of UK culture, a very different picture would probably be attained. The king seems everywhere. His Majesty's Revenue and Customs, His Majesty's Courts, the Royal Mail. The crown is atop the emblem of the army and the parliament. The monarch's face is on banknotes and postage stamps. So if a future historian looks at that body of evidence, being otherwise disconnected from UK life, perhaps by several millennia, the likely conclusion would be that this country was a near absolute monarchy. even though it is patently not. With these thoughts in mind, let's now turn to ancient Egypt. Clearly, this is exactly the kind of case where we're dealing with a country where none of us have lived, and where there's therefore every chance of this sort of evidential bias. There are indeed very many representations of Pharaoh in Egyptian art and in texts, and this make him out as enormously powerful. From royal titles and theological treatises, we can infer that, officially at least, he had the status of a god and could be worshipped. At the same time, though, we must be especially careful not to take everything at face value, and not just because of the factors I've already discussed with the UK example. In dealing with perceptions of Egyptian culture, we also have the additional baggage of cultural interpretation stemming from the Hebrew scriptures and especially Christianity. Pharaoh is the archetypal autocrat, despotic, uncompromising, and frankly evil. Even if modern scholars no longer rely on the Bible as historical source like they did a century ago, the historical tendency for such views to color how we perceive ancient Egypt is still there in the background. So it's important to challenge these preconceptions. In doing so, the first consideration I'd like to raise is that not all pharaohs could rule effectively. We know that some were too old to exercise meaningful power for a very significant part of their reign. Pepi II of the Old Kingdom comes to mind here, as he may have been on the throne for 96 years, and it's impossible to envisage him fully controlling the state, or at least a large part of that time. Others were too ill. The pharaoh probably best known to the modern public, Tutankhamun, was seriously disabled with a club foot and had chronic malaria too. Maybe not a club foot, but at least a deformed foot, certainly. And that's beyond dispute, because we have Tutankhamun's mummy, so we can analyze his health. He was also a child for most of his reign, again making it inconceivable that he could have wielded unchecked power. And then, finally, there were pharaohs who couldn't have realistically controlled Egypt fully by virtue of not even belonging to the culture, and in some cases neither speaking the Egyptian language nor being part of the social and religious fabric of the country. These are the Greek pharaohs of the Ptolemaic period, the successors of Alexander the Great after he proclaimed himself pharaoh, who retained their primary cultural identity as Greeks. They would have needed considerable help and assistance to run the country. So, if pharaohs couldn't do it all themselves, then what sort of individuals or institutions may have helped them, or even, in some cases, ruled on their behalf? The most important one of these was the vizier, with ancient Egypt already having a clear distinction between the head of state, the pharaoh, and the head of government. A very rich record of cross-period administrative documents reveals that it was the vizier who was in charge of most day-to-day aspects of running the country, including collecting tax, liaising with local officials, and administering justice. The installation of the vizier, a text from around 1400 BC describing the process of the vizier taking office, has the following exhortation for whoever may be pharaoh at the time. Look to the office of the vizier. Be vigilant concerning all that is done in it, for it is the mainstay of the entire land. Now, as for the vizierate, it is certainly not pleasant. Indeed, it is as bitter as gall. See, he is copper enclosing the gold of his master's house. Thus, according to the text, the bulk of the responsibility associated with day-to-day governance, the mainstay of the entire land, in fact rests with the vizier. We also know that there was an expectation for pharaoh and vizier to meet regularly, as illustrated by a related text of the same epoch, the duties of the vizier. He, that is the vizier, shall enter to greet the Lord each day, when the affairs of the two lands have been reported to him in his residence. He shall enter the great house when the overseer of the treasury has drawn up at his possession. So the vizier is to visit the pharaoh, and a senior official involved with state finances is to be present there too, presumably to help implement whatever may be decided. This points to a model of government that is about more than one man, and that has institutionalized processes of discussion and deliberation at its apex. Now, as well as this distinction between head of state and head of government, I'd also like to highlight the nature of pharaonic authority as something altogether more complex than simply a divine mandate, pharaoh being a god. Even if that is still the conventional narrative for reasons I've already set forth earlier, the reality is that pharaohs also derived and cemented elements of their authority from interaction with the people over whom they reigned. In the instruction for King Merikare, a noted piece of Egyptian wisdom literature guiding kings on how to govern wisely, and dated to about 2000 BC, we hear the following exhortations. Ensure that you are followed on account of your good character. Contemptible is he who forcefully binds the land to himself. This statement can almost be seen as urging the pharaoh to obtain some sort of popular mandate from the general population. Now, it's important to note that this does not mean that the Egyptians needed to somehow vote or otherwise endorse pharaonic policy for it to become law. This was not so, and the pharaoh and vizier could, in theory, legislate at will. But it does mean that from a perspective of what was the norm, what one might term customary law or even an unwritten constitution, it was expected that pharaoh would convince people and not just impose top-down government. To this end, the instruction for King Merikare further states, be skilled in speech, hence being strong, for the power of a king is in his tongue. Speech is mightier than combat. Indeed, in another comparison of the same period, the tale of Senue, the main protagonist describes a successful pharaoh as follows. He is the lord of graciousness, great of sweetness. He conquers by love. His city loves him more than its own self, and they rejoice for him more than for any god of theirs. The husbands and wives delight in him. Again, we have this motif of pharaoh deriving power from the will of the people, conquering by love. And this kind of approach would necessarily require some mechanism for consultation, institutions where opinions could be voiced and views expressed. Here, we know that ancient Egypt had numerous structures that probably served this purpose one way or another. The Egyptian language being very rich in terms denoting councils of various sorts. To list the most common ones, we have Eset, Gru, Arut, Portal, Westhead, Broadcourt, Marwite, 30, Mejmehu, Tens of Lower Egypt, presumably a council for the north of the country, Mej Shma'u, Tens of Upper Egypt, presumably a council in the south of the country, Mejnejut Ra, a generic term for a consultation, Ruid, a generic term for court, Utweret 6, the 6 great enclosures, the central body overseen by the vizier, Kenbet, and Jarjat, both denoting local courts or councils. While we often don't know what exactly was discussed in each of these, and the extent to which these interacted with central government or dealt wholly with local matters, we do get a picture of lots of institutions being in place where discussions about how affairs were run could proceed. And that's a key indicator of the state apparatus stretching far beyond arbitrary rule. We do have some snippets of text which give an insight into what the idea of pharaoh and council might have entailed. In the account of the Megiddo campaign, commissioned by Thutmose III in the 15th century BC, a description is offered of how pharaoh engages with his soldiers before beginning military action. His Majesty decreed a consultation with his strong armed force, saying, that vile enemy of Kadesh has entered Megiddo. These are where the war is being fought, and he's there right now. Tell me what is in your hearts. Here, we should acknowledge that this is an example from a time of war, when we might expect government consultation to be somewhat non-standard. However, we do also have evidence for Pharaoh engaging in consultation with those around him in times of peace. The building inscription of Sinisret I from around 1950 BC says, the king made glorious appearance and was enthroned in the audience hall to make conversation with his followers, the retainers of the palace and the nobles of the privy quarters. The matters were decreed in accordance with them being heard, the consultations serving as instructions. So we know that Pharaoh had a separate head of government, sought wider approval for his actions, had a range of institutions through which to do this, and engaged in consultation. But we can go further, for we know also that there were certain accepted limits on royal authority, in some ways even resembling what we might today call the rule of law. We can exemplify this via a well-known passage in the classic Egyptian narrative tale, the story of King Cheops and the magicians, from about 1650 BC. Cheops, also often called Khufu, is the builder of the Great Pyramid and would have been a famous figure for Egyptians of later generations. So rulers in subsequent epochs would have been able to relate to him, and we might expect that the story mentioning him aims to pass on a certain didactic meaning. In the story, Cheops is described as fallible. The king makes mistakes. He's bored and wants to have some fun by arbitrarily executing a prisoner, hoping that a priest at his court, named Jedi, will then reconnect the severed head as part of a magic show. However, Jedi objects, and the story says, His Majesty said, "It's true that you know how to reattach a severed head?" Jedi said, "Yes, I know how to, sovereign my lord." His Majesty said, "Bring me a prisoner who's in jail and have him executed." But Jedi said, "Certainly not to a man, sovereign my lord. Doing something like this to the august flock people is not allowed." This focus on procedure, following established regulations, is on occasion backed up by explicit provisions in texts dealing with how certain matters of law and administration should be handled. If we return to the duties of the vizier, which we have already alluded to earlier, we have this example of something that I think we can all agree is quite a tightly defined law. As for anyone who will make petition to the vizier regarding fields, he will order him to himself, in addition to listening to the overseer of farmlands and the judicial council. He should allow a delay for him consisting of 2 months for his fields in Upper and Lower Egypt. However, as for his fields which are near to the southern city, Thebes, and to the royal residence, he should allow a delay for him consisting of 3 days, as that which is in the law. He should hear every petitioner in accordance with this law which is in his hand. Now, I should add that the significance of Thebes is, of course, that that was the religious capital of the country at the time. Now, the level of detail is clearly not something that you would expect in an arbitrary system. And to back this up further, we've also evidence of clearly defined punishments for specific offenses. In a text from about 1300 BC, the Decree of Horemheb, we have a wide range of sanctions, and the offenses they correspond to described in meticulous detail. Here is but one such example of many. As for any soldier, regarding whom it's heard that he still continues to confiscate animal hides right up to the present day, this is after the passing of an earlier provision outlawing the practice, law will be enforced against him by smiting him with 100 blows and 5 open wounds, together with taking away the animal hide which he seized for himself by theft. So we have law as a separate source of authority. It isn't simply Pharaoh saying that such and such a person should be punished ad hoc in such and such a way, but there's a more systemic, institutional approach to meting out punishment. Doubtless, some of the organized structures and councils that I've already alluded to earlier would have played a role in bringing this about. And indeed, we even have explicit evidence for the separation of executive and legal authority. For the duties of the vizier states that it is not permissible that any official have power over dispensing justice in his own administrative office. If a major accusation emerges against one of the subordinate officials in his office, he will make sure that the accused is taken to court, it being the vizier who will punish him in line with his transgression. This separation of powers remains a key principle of institutionalized forms of state governance to this day, so it is striking that it was already present in ancient Egypt. Significantly, we know it applied to Pharaoh too. In the Turin Judicial Papyrus, which contains a record of the trial of criminals who had conspired to kill the pharaoh, the text opens with the pharaoh who was targeted giving a short speech. In it, he says the following about the judicial proceedings. They, that is the judges, interrogated them, that is the criminals, and put them to death by their own hands, but I do not know them. And they punished others too, and I do not know them either. Thus, even though the pharaoh is both the head of state and the victim of the crime, he is at pains to stress that he is not involved in the trial. The power of the court is therefore clearly separated from that of the crown, a sufficiently important feature in the text to emphasize it directly. And this brings us to our conclusion. In this paper, I've attempted to show why ancient Egypt is important to us all in our efforts to understand the evolution of modern statehood. Egypt is the oldest state, for which we have extensive evidence showing a reliance on a range of institutions other than just arbitrary rule, as commonly assumed. We do know that Pharaoh definitely reigned, but not necessarily that he ruled in any kind of absolute way. We know that the head of state and head of government were distinct, and that often Pharaoh relied on persuasion and counsel rather than just top-down decrees. And we know that there was a notion of legal authority distinct from Pharaoh, laws with power in and of themselves, the adjudication of which was separate from the executive. In this lies a message for everyone interested in statehood and its evolution, namely that non-arbitrary, institution-based government with wide-ranging popular input is likely far older than we often think. And on that note, I close my paper and thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.